This audio file is going to form part of the Week 10 SWOP field notes, and I'm just going to give some vocal reflections on this week's voice tutorial in Second Life, and hopefully there's going to be some written summaries for part of this post as well. So what I'm intending to do, hopefully, is show the difference between the ideas that I communicate here verbally and the ones that hopefully will be underneath, communicated in a written format. So I'm going to kind of improvise some of these thoughts in a moment, to an extent, because I do have some written notes as well. A rough guide to follow. So if I start at the beginning, before the tutorial, I can certainly say that I was nervous about the prospect of speaking online with other members of the group, and I did spend quite some time checking and configuring the microphone and the sound settings on the MacBook a few days before the tutorial began, and I became very conscious that I wasn't able to hear the sound of my own voice, and that seemed to cause me to be quite nervous. And I perhaps even say at one point I was more nervous about how the sound of my voice would be perceived by others than actually the worth or the merit of what I was going to say. At one point I was perhaps more confident after doing some of the core readings that I was able to sound fairly coherent in this academic tutorial that we were going to have. However, it was the sound of my voice which I wasn't able to hear, and I wasn't able to gauge myself whether that would sound viable as someone who's able to perhaps speak in authority about, or at least speak in an interesting way about this subject. In terms of preparing myself, I did prepare some notes, some short, brief notes on the Lombard and Ditton paper, and I'd used those notes in the tutorial itself. So I had some kind of choice phrases prepared, and yeah, I guess I felt I did that to try and support what I was going to say, and probably because I was not confident enough to completely improvise the tutorial. So I guess I could say there that I was quite concerned about how others would perceive how knowledgeable I was, rather than looking at the tutorial as a place where I could learn something. I still think I was conscious of that, but I think at the time I was also just as much conscious of how others would be judging what I knew, which in hindsight isn't perhaps that productive a way to look at it. Certainly when the tutorial began, I did perceive nervousness in other participants, and that was perhaps due to long periods of silence. It was due to lack of responses from some participants, and I'll also have to say I perceived a bit of trepidation, perhaps, in the tutor, in the tutor who was running that tutorial, and I think that the tutor expressed that in some ways herself. She was open and honest about that fact. But perhaps interestingly, I didn't sense that before the tutorial began. In the stage when this tutorial was being set up and students were being divided into the various groups, I certainly didn't perceive that nervousness in the tutor, although when the tutorial started and there was less people, it certainly felt more tense, and perhaps that could be the reason there. I can certainly say that I felt more confident as the tutorial progressed, and that could have been due to understanding some of the conversations that were going on, and a feeling that I'd contributed to those conversations in some small way gave me the kind of confidence to perhaps say more. I do want to comment on the slight delay that I perceived in using the voice chat. So after I had said a sentence, there was a small delay after the end of my sentence and before the beginning of any reply. Now, I'm certain, I'm thinking in hindsight that was a technical delay caused by the technology, and I think even one of the tutors mentioned during the tutorial that there was a slight delay. However, at the time, that very much felt as if there was a second or two where people were silent after what I'd said, and that was quite disconcerting. I wasn't sure whether they'd understood what I said, or indeed whether they were surprised at the sound of my voice. The other thing, perhaps the big thing that came out of the tutorial itself was the separation between the space in which we were talking and the virtual space of Second Life. I think that was quite perceptible, and a conversation came up about that. So I think others certainly felt that as well. The fact that although our avatars were in this 3D environment, because they weren't moving, because there wasn't much of a visual stimulus there, it meant that visually I was very much in the real world, which for me was my room and my laptop and the wall and the laptop screen. Whereas in the auditory environment, I was wearing closed ear headphones, so that certainly cut off the real world sounds and allowed me to concentrate on the virtual world sounds. So I was more immersed that way, and that seemed to create some kind of separation. The other sort of dimension of separation, I think, is the fact that I wasn't controlling my avatar. So the communication was definitely, there's a sense the communication was definitely coming from me, and it wasn't going through the avatar, whereas previous sessions in Second Life, having to type, having to instant message, involved me physically, involved the fingers on the keyboard, which felt as if that was a communication through the avatar. And voice seemed to completely separate me from avatar. The last point I want to make about the voice chat tutorial in Second Life was perhaps how it was different from what I perceived it to be beforehand. Some of the text that I'd read about voice chat framed it as quite a quick, rapid kind of communication, and I'd equated it perhaps to instant messaging, where each person's contribution is quite short. I didn't really have that sense from the voice tutorial. I felt I could elaborate for a while on something, and it certainly didn't feel rapid or as intense as some of the instant messaging sessions we've had before. It actually felt rather slow and calm, and And if I think about those instant messaging sessions, I didn't feel as able to dwell on a point as I did in the voice tutorial.